In the aftermath of World War II and the Holocaust that annihilated the great bulk of European Jewry, it seemed as though a Jewish state in Palestine was the last best hope of the Jewish people. Yet, the way seemed blocked due to British policy that had been in effect for decades. In 1922, Winston Churchill issued a new white paper, appearing to undo much of the force of the Balfour Declaration, even while claiming to affirm it. The tension which has prevailed from time to time in Palestine is mainly due to apprehensions which are entertained both by sections of the Arab and by sections of the Jewish population. These apprehensions, so far as the Arabs are concerned, are partly based upon exaggerated interpretations of the meaning of the Balfour Declaration, favoring the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine, made on behalf of His Majesty's government on 2 November 1917. Unauthorized statements have been made to the effect that the purpose in view is to create a wholly Jewish Palestine. Phrases have been used such as that Palestine is to become as Jewish as England is English. His Majesty's government regard any such expectation as impracticable and have no such aim in view. They would draw the attention to the fact that the terms of the declaration referred to do not contemplate that Palestine as a whole should be converted into a Jewish national home, but that such a home should be founded in Palestine. In this connection, it has been observed with satisfaction that at a meeting of the Zionist Congresses, the supreme governing body of the Zionist organization, held at Carlsbad in September 1921, a resolution was passed expressing as the official statement of Zionist aims the determination of the Jewish people to live with the Arab people on terms of unity and mutual respect, and together with them to make the common home into a flourishing community, the upbuilding of which may assure to each of its peoples an undisturbed national development. It is contemplated that the status of all citizens of Palestine, in the eyes of the law, shall be Palestinian. And it has never been intended that they, or any section of them, should possess any other juridical status. So far as the Jewish population of Palestine are concerned, it appears that some among them are apprehensive that His Majesty's government may depart from the policy embodied in the Declaration of 1917. It is necessary, therefore, once more to affirm that these fears are unfounded, and that that declaration, reaffirmed by the Conference of the Principal Allied Powers at San Remo, and again in the Treaty of Sèvres, is not susceptible of change. For the fulfillment of this policy, it is necessary that the Jewish community in Palestine should be able to increase its numbers by immigration. And this immigration cannot be so great in volume as to exceed whatever may be the economic capacity of the country at the time to absorb new arrivals. It is essential to ensure that the immigrants should not be a burden upon the people of Palestine as a whole, and that they should not deprive any section of the present population of their employment. Hitherto, the immigration has fulfilled these conditions, and the number of immigrants since the British occupation has been about 25,000. The document notes on an exception, however, saying it is necessary also to ensure that persons who are politically undesirable be excluded from Palestine. And every precaution has been and will be taken by the administration to that end. And it is not the case, as has been represented by the Arab delegation, that during the war, His Majesty's government gave an undertaking that an independent national government should be at once established in Palestine. In 1936, after an Arab campaign of sabotage and terrorism that turned into a virtual revolt, the British government appointed a royal commission headed by Lord Peel to investigate the situation. It concluded that the only logical solution to resolving the contradictory aspirations of the Jews and Arabs was the partition of Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. The Arabs rejected the plan because it would have forced them to accept the creation of a Jewish state and required some Palestinians to live under Jewish domination. The Zionists opposed the Peel plan's boundaries because they would have been confined to little more than a ghetto of 5,000 out of the 26,700 square kilometers remaining in Palestine. Nevertheless, the Zionists decided to negotiate with the British, while the Arabs refused to consider any compromises. In 1939, just prior to the outbreak of World War II, the British government signed off on the notorious Malcolm MacDonald White Paper. It called for the establishment of an Arab state in Palestine within 10 years, and for limiting Jewish immigration to no more than 75,000 over the following 5 years. This at a time when an influx of such immigration from Nazi-occupied Europe might have done much, at least to limit the ensuing Holocaust. After the 5-year period, no one would be allowed in without the consent of the Arab population. The White Paper also proposed leaving the Jerusalem area and a broad corridor to the coast under British rule. Though the Arabs had been granted a concession on Jewish immigration and been offered independence, the goal of the Arab nationalists, they nonetheless repudiated the White Paper. Thereafter, the terrorist campaign resumed. From 1936 to 1939, 517 Jews were killed, about one-half of them in the July to October 1938 period. The British government gave way. Some immigrants, or olim, entered the country on visas issued under the White Paper quota, but the majority came as illegal immigrants. This immigration, under the noses of the supervising British, was called Aliyah Bet. They arrived by land and by sea, from Europe and the Middle East, in contravention of the mandatory government's orders. The issue, of course, is when, if ever, such illegal behavior is justified. Under the laws in existence at the time, it was not, especially from the British perspective. After all, His Majesty's government didn't want to upset the demographic apple cart in the region. As far as they were concerned, an influx of Jews into the region, when it was predominantly inhabited by Arabs, could only presage trouble. But what about the trouble in the continent of Europe and the millions of Jews whose lives were in imminent danger at the hands of the Nazis? As far as the Jews of Palestine were concerned, their goal was simple: create facts on the ground. The loss of contact with European countries, the hazards of maritime travel under wartime conditions, and the difficulty in obtaining vessels for transport of illegal immigrants placed severe constraints on Aliyah Bet. Several boatloads of immigrants who managed to reach Palestine were sent back by British authorities, upholding the quota system. Many lost their lives at sea or in the Nazi inferno in Europe. Overland, 1,350 Syrian Jews were escorted to Palestine in an intricate and audacious operation. During the years 1944 to 1948, the Jews in Eastern Europe sought to leave by any means. Emissaries from the Yishuv, Jewish partisans, and Zionist youth movements cooperated in establishing an escape organization called Bericha, which helped nearly 200,000 Jews leave Europe. The majority settled in Palestine. In 1942, the Zionist movement adopted the Biltmore program, which called for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. After the war, the Haganah, the largest Jewish military organization, concentrated its efforts on increasing the clandestine immigration of the survivors of the Holocaust to Palestine. Military operations against the British were, by and large, undertaken to further this end. Two other Jewish military groups, the Irgun Tzva'i Leumi and the Lochamei Cherut Israel, or Lechi, attacked British troops and installations. For a short time in 1945 and 1946, the three organizations joined forces in Jewish resistance. In 1946, the British rejected the recommendations of an Anglo-American committee, supported by US President Truman, for the admission to Palestine of 100,000 European Jews, mainly from displaced persons camps across Europe. The Haganah section of the Jewish resistance movement reacted by blowing up all the bridges linking Palestine with neighboring states. Throughout 1947, tension continued to rise, and there was no end to acts of terror. The government responded with even more repression. 7 members of the Irgun Tzva'i Leumi and Lechi were executed, and the Irgun Tzva'i Leumi responded by hanging 2 British sergeants. The spectacle of refugee ships turned back from the shores of Palestine roused world opinion. From the end of the war until the birth of the State of Israel in 1948, illegal immigration was the major method of immigration. 66 illegal immigration sailings were organized during these years, but only a few managed to penetrate the British blockade and bring their passengers ashore. In 1947, 4,500 immigrants on a ship called the Exodus were sent back to Europe by the Mandatory government. The British stopped the vessels carrying the immigrants at sea and interned the captured immigrants in camps in Cyprus. Most of these persons only arrived in Israel after the establishment of the state. Approximately 80,000 illegal immigrants reached Palestine during 1945 to 1948. In total, it's estimated that between 1939 and 1948, approximately 110,000 Jewish immigrants had participated in Aliyah Bet by sailing to the territory of the British Mandate. The number of immigrants during the entire Mandate period, legal and illegal alike, was approximately 480,000, close to 90% of them from Europe. By 1948, the population of the Yishuv had expanded to 650,000. Finally, unable to cope with the growing pressure, the British handed over the problem to the United Nations. The UN established a special commission on Palestine to devise a solution. Delegates from 11 nations attended and found what had long been apparent. The conflicting national aspirations of Jews and Arabs could not be reconciled. Although most of the Commission's members acknowledged the need to find a compromise solution, it was difficult for them to envision one, given the parties' intractability. At a meeting with a group of Arabs in Beirut, the Czechoslovakian member of the Commission told his audience, "I have listened to your demands, and it seems to me that in your view, the compromise is we want our demands met completely. The rest can be divided among those left. When they returned, the delegates of 7 nations, Canada, Czechoslovakia, Guatemala, the Netherlands, Peru, Sweden, and Uruguay, recommended the establishment of 2 separate states, Jewish and Arab, to be joined by economic union with Jerusalem, an internationalized enclave. 3 nations, India, Iran, and Yugoslavia, recommended a unitary state with Arab and Jewish provinces. Australia abstained. The Jews of Palestine were not satisfied with the small territory allotted to them by the Commission, nor were they happy that Jerusalem was severed from the Jewish state. Nevertheless, they welcomed the compromise. The Arabs rejected the recommendations. As the partition vote approached, it became clear that little hope existed for a political solution to a problem that transcended politics. The Arabs' unwillingness to accept a Jewish state in Palestine and the refusal of the Zionists to settle for anything less. The implacability of the Arabs was evident when the Jewish agency representatives, David Horowitz and Abba Eban, made a last-ditch effort to reach a compromise in a meeting with Arab League Secretary Azam Pasha on September 16, 1947. Pasha told them bluntly, "The Arab world is not in a compromising mood. It's likely, Mr. Horowitz, that your plan is rational and logical, but the fate of nations is not decided by rational logic. Nations never concede, they fight. You won't get anything by peaceful means or compromise. You can perhaps get something, but only by the force of your arms. We shall try to defeat you. I am not sure we'll succeed, but we'll try. We were able to drive out the Crusaders, but on the other hand, we lost Spain and Persia. It may be that we shall lose Palestine, but it's too late to talk of peaceful solutions." The ad hoc committee of the UN General Assembly rejected the Arab demand for a unitary Arab state. The majority recommendation for partition was subsequently adopted 33-13 with 10 abstentions on November 29, 1947. The surrounding Arab states declared that they would oppose the partition by armed force. Aware of this, the British still refused to cooperate in its implementation and announced their impending withdrawal for May 15, 1948. Arab violence, helped by volunteers from Arab countries, had started immediately after the UN decision, with assaults on Jewish traffic and against Jewish settlements and quarters, to such an extent that a full-scale war was in progress even before the British left. On May 14, 1948, at a special meeting of an elected council, David Ben-Gurion read out the Declaration of Independence establishing the State of Israel.
זוהי זכותו הטבעית של העם היהודי להיות ככל עם ועם עומד ברשות עצמו במדינתו הריבונית, אשר תפתח לרווחה את שערי המולדת לכל יהודי ותעניק לעם היהודי מעמד של אומה שוות זכויות בתוך העמים. לפיכך נתכנסנו אנו חברי מועצת העם, נציגי היישוב העברי והתנועה הציונית, ביום סיום המנדט הבריטי על ארץ ישראל. ותוקף זכותנו הטבעית וההיסטורית ועל יסוד החלטת עצרת האומות המאוחדות אנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל היא מדינת ישראל. מתוך ביטחון בצור ישראל, הננו חותמים בחתימת ידינו לעדות על הכרזה זו.
On May 15th, the regular armies of 5 Arab states, including air forces, armor, and artillery, invaded. That day, Egyptian planes bombed Tel Aviv, and their ground forces advanced northward and cut off the Negev. Small, isolated Jewish settlements held up the advance, which was stopped 20 miles from Tel Aviv in a major engagement. Jordan's Arab Legion and Iraqi troops attacked from the east. The Legion occupied most of the Judean hills, East Jerusalem, and the Old City, except for the Jewish quarter, which fell later. The Iraqis tried to advance westward to the sea. The Israeli forces, despite several desperate and costly efforts, failed to take Latrun, and therefore failed to widen the Jerusalem corridor. Jewish Jerusalem was under siege and bombarded constantly. The discovery of a new route contributed greatly to the ability of the city to hold out and prevented its isolation. The Syrians advanced into a densely populated Jewish agricultural area, but were stopped at the oldest of the communal settlements, Kibbutz Degania. The Lebanese made no real headway. On April 9, 1948, the Irgun and Lehi underground groups attacked the village of Deir Yassin at the entrance to Jerusalem and killed over 100 people, most of them women and children. Though the Irgun and Lehi vehemently denied it, Arabs claimed there had been a massacre. The Jewish agency apologized for the attack, but the Arabs seized upon the Deir Yassin attack as an excuse for reprisals. The first such reprisal was carried out on April 13, 1948, on a medical convoy to Hadassah Hospital. Evidently, it had the tacit approval of the British authorities. About 80 persons, mostly medical personnel and injured patients, were killed in an ambush. It seems that most were killed because the British were purposely tardy in sending forces to stop the fighting. On June 11th, a 4-week truce came into effect, and Israel used the lull for training and reorganization. When the fighting resumed, Israel took the initiative. In a major offensive, Lydda and Ramleh fell, removing the threat from Tel Aviv and opening the road to Jerusalem. The lower Galilee was cleared and Nazareth fell. But attempts to conquer the old city of Jerusalem failed. After a second ceasefire, which began on July 19th, an October offensive broke through the Egyptian lines in the south, forcing them to withdraw and encircling an Egyptian force, also conquering part of the Judean hills. At the end of 1948, Israeli forces advanced into Sinai as far as El Arish and Rafia, cutting off the whole of the Egyptian army. But they withdrew after US and British political pressure. In the north, the Arab Army of Deliverance was expelled. An armistice agreement was signed with Egypt in February 1949 on the island of Rhodes. In March, in the face of an Israeli advance, the Legion evacuated Eilat. Later, armistice agreements were signed with Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Neither Iraq nor Saudi Arabia, which had sent contingents to fight, recognized any such armistice. In the end, even though there was a cessation of fighting, there would be no peace. More trouble was on its way.